So, oops. So as Julie went over my credentials and my background, I just wanted to highlight that my training, education, degrees, and titles above serve to highlight my positionality, power, and privilege. I'm white, I'm cisgendered, and I'm educated. And while I do hold other identities that afforded me life experience as a member of multiple minoritized groups, overall, I acknowledge and own my power and privilege in the positions that I hold. I have no disclosures to make. I have no financial relationship to this program. And the views that are expressed today are my own and do not necessarily represent the views, policies, and positions of the University of New Mexico or my employer's University of Massachusetts Medical School or Northwestern University Law School or Medical School. So in today's talk, the things that I hope to cover are describing the need for culturally humble forensic psychologists, identifying DEIB, or what I refer to as diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging teaching resources. And just to say, just to tell you a little bit about that, you'll usually see EDI or DEI as the acronym. But it's my strong belief that I'd like to aspire to do more than just diversity, equity, and inclusion, and move beyond just including others, but creating an environment in which people feel they belong. And then identifying ways of modifying and using these DEIB teaching resources in forensic training. As you know, during these last several years, last year, perhaps in particular, there has been an increase in the visibility of race-based violence and hate rhetoric. And we can see the racial, ethnic, gender, socioeconomic, and racial health disparities. As the greater APA community has taken pause, we too, I think, in forensic psychology, as educators, advisors, supervisors, and mentors who all work in socially unjust systems, take time to reflect individually and as a profession, to start having open and honest dialogues and create our curricula and training opportunities with greater attention to these issues and with more intention. In preparation for the role that Julie said that I'm taking on, which is the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Belonging for the UMass internship program in collaboration with Worcester Recovery Center and Hospital here in Massachusetts, I started to assist in some of the curriculum development this past year. And I faced many challenges in doing that. Facing many challenges, I think, is my nice way of saying that I think I made many mistakes. And I wished I had done some things differently. And in the spirit of cultural humility, I realized I needed more help and more allies. So as I move through this presentation, I want you to know that I in no way hold myself out to be an expert in these issues. In fact, I'm doing this talk in part because I want to engage with all of you who serve as mentors and as educators, as supervisors in forensic psychology, so that we can exchange resources and build community together around teaching. I found that when I was having difficulty and when I wanted to talk things out, I often turned to psychologists from other areas like clinical, community, and counseling psychology. And while I found some allies in forensic psychology, not as many as I had hoped. So I'm hoping to reach out and find you guys through this presentation. So in describing the need for culturally humble forensic psychologists, I think that we're all pretty much aware of the changing demographics. So in less than 30 years, whites will no longer be the majority. By 2050, whites will shrink to about 47% of the population, according to the US Census Bureau from 2012 statistics. In fact, in 2019, for the first time, more than half of the nation's population under age 16 identified as a racial or ethnic minority. Among this group, Latinx and Black residents together comprise nearly 40% of that population, and more people identify as biracial and multiracial. In terms of sexuality, many folks feel our labels of sexuality don't capture their identities or their experiences. And so there are expanding definitions and recognition of sexual orientation so that people sometimes describe their sexual orientation and experiences as being more on a spectrum and may change over time. As far as gender, we often don't collect this data systematically, but the best numbers that I could come across were available from a single 2016 study from the Williams Institute at the UCLA School of Law, which is now 5 years old. That study revealed that at least 0.5% of Americans identify as transgender or gender nonconforming, which I'm not very good at math, but they say totals about 2 million people. And again, that's 5 years old. In some places, and as we talk about transnational migration, we know that in some places there are more flexible borders, such as if we think about the EU. And with social media and the shrinking world, there are vast experiences of enculturation, settlement, identity formation, and of course, different ways of understanding race and culture. We also, we as forensic psychologists and some of us who identify as correctional psychologists interact with a higher number of marginalized groups. We know that to be true just by the nature of the mental health system. And of course, we're probably pretty familiar already with the criminal justice and juvenile justice systems, where there's an overrepresentation of Black and Latinx individuals who are arrested. When we think about other areas in which we work in, such as the Child Protective Services, based on 2016 estimates, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Black children are 2.4 to 2.7 times more likely to lose a parent in the child welfare system, to experience the termination of one or both of their biological parents' rights than white children are. In civil commitment cases, there is a growing number of people who identify as Black psychiatric survivors, as well as non-conforming or transgender psychiatric survivors who feel they have been mislabeled and have lost civil liberties by being misunderstood and by being labeled for just simply who they are and how they enter and how they identify. We interface with more systems that embody colonized thinking and often do harm to marginalized groups. There are more disparities in these contexts as we look at places that we interface with, such as jails, prisons, state hospitals, the foster care system, and schools. This need for DEIB has recently been codified. In 2019, the APA recognized this need for cultural humility, and in their development of guidelines in race and ethnicity and psychology, promoting responsiveness and equity, which is referenced in my reference list, so that you can easily maintain a copy of those. And they did this because psychologists, they said, need to have the knowledge, awareness, and skills to work with and for growing racial and ethnic cultural minority communities, such as Asian Americans, Latinx, North African, and including diversity within communities, not just between communities. And the recognition of intersectional statuses, such as that of gender, religion, class, and ability. These guidelines are rooted in our psychological literature, but also from critical race theory, ethnic studies, social work, and anthropology, and recognizes the need for multidisciplinary approaches to critically thinking about these issues. While these guidelines are aspirational, I personally feel like, and would like to think that we should be more aspirational in and not just strive to be doing the minimum, especially in our roles as mentors. The guidelines that I've outlined here on this slide are in education and training. The guidelines themselves encompass information on education and training, as well as practice and research. But guidelines 5 through 8 specified here are specifically to education and training, and describe how we should create more inclusive curriculum and educational environments that promote racial and ethno-cultural responsiveness, equity, and justice, strive to promote self-awareness, critical thinking, and reflexive practice, strive to develop knowledge and skills in students and trainees and in their community engagement with racially and ethnically diverse populations, and strive to promote education systems that address the negative effects of racial and ethnocultural biases and foster health, well-being, and justice. We can also look at our APA Code of Ethics, our forensic specialty guidelines, which both tell us that we should only be practicing in work in which we are competent in, and that we should be able to discuss and be transparent about our limitations in our competence. We find those also in the race and ethnicity guidelines in psychology, which I just referenced, as well as in the guidelines for clinical supervision and health service psychology that talk about the need for cultural humility in our practices as well as in our supervision. So I want to start out by saying what DEIB is not. It's not a separate diversity checklist where after the fact we look at a couple of cultural or racial identity factors. It's not just bringing in speakers or having a separate curriculum or engaging in what some people would call performative acts. While I'm talking about ways to add things to our programs, DEIB or EDI programming, it's not necessarily the addition of new programs or curricula that we need. I know that other internship directors, postdoc directors, supervisors, graduate faculty, and especially trainees are probably listening right now and thinking how busy they are in their respective training programs already. There's no room for extra things. You're all doing incredible work already. DEIB is also very much, and maybe perhaps most of it, I would argue, is just a new way of doing our work, the work that we're already doing in a more mindful way, and decolonizing our thinking and really appreciating how the people we serve experience their lives and how those experiences are different than our own. So again, it's more than just curriculum. It's changing policies. It's a new way of looking at things. And it's deciding where we stand on things such as advocacy and social justice and what that means in the work we already do. What we want to step away from, but what's easy for us to sort of fall into the trap of, is this performative allyship, which can be defined as the practice of words, posts, and or gestures that do more to promote an individual's virtuous moral compass versus actually helping the causes that they're intending to showcase. So what does this mean? It means that we need to start with becoming more self-aware and moving beyond this performative allyship, which is like posting things on Twitter with trending hashtags like Black Lives Matter and sharing articles, for example. While this in some ways increases knowledge, it's not enough. If we think about this, we realize that spreading these hashtags and engaging in just performative things are rooted in self-gratification and really distances us from doing our own hard emotional work in checking our biases, acknowledging our privilege and our positionalities, and misses the important work of self-reflection that as supervisors, mentors, educators, and advocates, we so much need to do ourselves. And to that end, this work in and of itself is very hard. And it's very time-consuming work. That's not going to be, that's usually done in private, and is not going to add necessarily to your CV. In fact, doing some of this work takes you away from doing some of the things that are going to advance your career in the short term, at least. As one of the trainers that I've worked with, Pranora Aurora, out at Teachers College, she stated so eloquently that this work begins with decolonizing ourselves. And I'm going to skip to the next slide just so that I can tell you what I mean when I keep referring to colonizing and decolonizing. So colonizing is reproducing existing conditions of oppression and perpetuating deficit-based views that maintain systems that disenfranchise marginalized groups. So basically policies and practices that preserve the status quo and prioritize the voices and values of those people that are already in power. So, as Dr. Aurora said, this begins with decolonizing ourselves so that we become more prepared to train a new generation of providers, so that these providers can help repair the silencing and oppression of minoritized individuals and communities. Many of you are probably familiar with Sue and Sue's multicultural counseling theories, as well as their cultural humble supervision models. And I take this and borrow it from them, as they believe that there are 3 steps in doing this type of work: awareness, knowledge, and skills. And so this area is in our own self-awareness. In understanding this, we need to understand what the experiences are of students of color. Research shows that many students of color report that they're asked to speak for other folks of color, as if they're a homogenous group. And they report a feeling as if they don't belong. Faculty of color report that they are often encouraged to work with marginalized groups, sometimes at the expense of their own work. And they're often asked or expected to invest substantial time in diversity-related activities. They're expected to serve as mentors for students and other faculty of color, and this is all at the expense of their own research and teaching agendas, which has led to career stagnation, lack of mobility, and tenure. So, in recognizing power, privilege, and positionality, for those of you out there that are white like me or hold other positions of power, I think it takes a lot of vulnerability in being able to self-reflect and recognizing our own biases. And this is hard work. Research shows, making students feel comfortable talking about social identities is challenging and difficult work. And it can be frustrating and hard. So for example, research shows that those of us faculty who choose to do work in this area are disproportionately subjected to poor evaluations and complaints to administration, because students are being asked to talk about things that they are not comfortable talking about, and they often report discomfort and write poor reviews and actually complain to administration as to why they need to engage in such reflection and talk. Just the other day, I don't know if one of my colleagues, Jeff Burrell, might be in the audience or not. I sent him a text message the other day declaring that I quit, because sometimes the work is overwhelming and difficult, but I believe that it's important. So where I have found some strength, and that I hope can help others doing this type of work, is engaging in trainings. I've very much highly recommend Academics for Black Lives, their trainings. This year, this July, was their 2nd annual training, or conference, I should say. They had a series of talks and interactive exercises and models that they discussed, as well as a list of cultural consultants that are willing to come out to respective schools and programs and to teach and to also help explain certain concepts. And I found this to be incredible work. I believe I have that in my references. I strongly encourage it. While that particular conference is now over, I think that they would be very willing to share the videos with a donation to their conference so that they can continue to do this type of work. And I also want to recognize that there are many folks within APLS and everything that are doing this kind of work, like April Alexander, for example, Antoinette Kavanaugh, who I respect as one of my mentors. So there are people that are doing important trainings that we should be attending. And then finally, accountability groups. I found that it's important not just to talk among like-minded people. So Academics for Black Lives, or A4BL as they're referred to, have created accountability groups that you can join, or you can feel free to create your own. And these are groups that they provide some structure to, if you prefer that structure of materials that you can read and reflect on, journaling exercises, podcasts, films, videos that you watch throughout the week and then come together and discuss. And is also a group where you can bounce off ideas and process things that you're doing in your own work with your students. So for example, in one of the accountability groups that I'm in, it's comprised of graduate students and faculty from multiple disciplines. These are faculty that are working in art schools, that are biologists, that are in engineering programs. And it's refreshing to be able to talk about how they're doing DEIB training and curriculum development in their own programs, and how we can work together in doing a better job. So I went over colonizing. So I will go to decolonizing supervision, mentorship, and curriculum. And I want to just say that these references that I have in here are to articles, but also to videos that are on YouTube that come from the Teachers College out at Columbia, that are about decolonizing supervision, decolonizing mentorship, and decolonizing curriculum. And I strongly recommend them. Again, they are available on YouTube for free. And you'll find that information in my reference list. So starting with supervision. Supervision is a distinct professional activity, but how many of us that actually do supervision have had any training, have had any formal training in what it means to be a good supervisor, or have taken a continuing education class in this? Oftentimes, supervision is neglected. It is not something that we take time to actually build up and train people to do well. And so not only have we not done that, have done a really good job in doing that, we haven't done, in addition to that, we haven't done the work that we need to do to approach supervision in a culturally humble way. The supervisory relationship in and of itself is anchored in power. And the research shows us that we should be more attentive to our own attitudes as well as those of our supervisees, that we should be respectful regardless of the topic, that we should collaborate with our supervisees, listening to and valuing what they say and reflecting on it, respecting other cultural worldviews while expressing our own, and enacting cultural humility, which is the lack of certainty that one is always right. And I want to say that when you're a supervisor, especially if you're a new supervisor, you have this added burden of feeling that you have to be right because you're a supervisor and people are looking up to you. But it's okay to not have all the answers and to be open to seeing things from different ways. And again, I haven't always done this. My students and trainees have called me out, and my instinctive reaction, embarrassingly, but I will share this with you, was to call my white colleagues for validation that I didn't do anything wrong, because it was difficult to hear that perhaps I had approached something in a way maybe I could have done better. And then I sat with it, and I realized how hard it was for supervisees and trainees and students to call you out, to call us out, especially since we're the supervisors and the ones that are going to be writing performative evaluations about them, and we're going to be judging them in those ways. And so it takes a lot of courage for those individuals to call us out, and we should reflect on it and try to do better once we know things are issues. Our pervasive non-disclosure in supervision is also a delimiting factor in decolonizing supervision. There are great disparities in the supervisory relationship. In fact, when supervisors have been asked in some of the research that's been done, supervisors have rated self-awareness as low in importance. So being self-aware is something that they didn't value as much or think was as important in their role as supervisors. And if we think about that, we think that in many times, this may be due to many reasons, such as the fact that many supervisors hold positions of privilege and power, that we are able, that we are English speaking, and that many of us are citizens. So we often don't have to question our values and our beliefs. And we have to look at those that are devalued, such as Indigenous, LGBTQ, lower SES, older age, and immigrants. Implicit in this relationship is also SES, as a lot of, there's pressure from graduate students to match for internship and for postdocs and things, because they can't afford to pay for an extra year of graduate school as they're waiting to be placed in internship programs. And I think the literature will say that there is not enough funding really to train the trainers and to give us this opportunity to do a better job at being supervisors in these certain contexts. And the literature also says that we need to formalize policies in supervisory contracts. And I will give a shout out to Felissa Kortner, who is the director of the clinical training program out at Atascadero State Hospital, who has successfully, I think, formalized really great culturally humble practices in her supervisory contracts out there, and who has graciously shared that with me. And I think that we can open this up to sharing some of those with all of you as well. In terms of mentorship, we see that as having two primary functions: career development, so teaching people the ropes and preparing trainees for career development, and also a psychosocial piece where we enhance the sense of competency, role modeling, confirmation. But when we lack people of color, we lack role models, and there's a tendency to stereotype. And again, experiences of microaggressions from peers and faculty. So in our curricula, which is what I wanted to focus on, but I didn't want to neglect those other pieces, because I think before we can really do this work, we have to be self-aware and engage in those activities that we've been talking about. But in our curricula, we should be asking ourselves some important questions, such as statements about diversity, about how diversity is valued. Are we incorporating that in our syllabi? Are we incorporating that in our websites that describe our internship programs and our postdoctoral training programs? How do I address microaggressions in the classroom or in the places in which my interns or postdocs work? Do I use diverse images and examples that avoid stereotypes? Do I amplify voices of diverse experts in both research and lived experience in my assigned readings? If we just look at the reading lists that we have, a lot of times these are not, the authors are not people of color or who have lived experience in minoritized groups. And so that says something about our field, but it also says that we can borrow from other fields in anthropology, in social work, in community and counseling psychology, and look to have a well-rounded kind of experience for our students and trainees to see. Also, who are we inviting as our guest speakers to talk about things? Are we asking white individuals to do the presentations on racial trauma? And are we paying the guest speakers for their time, their labor, and their lived experience? So so these next couple slides are some specific activities that I have borrowed from the Psychology of Radical Healing syllabus, which a group has put out and has shared. It's readily available to the public, and it's in my reference list of different activities that you can do with students and trainees. For example, I mean, we think about having conversations and we think about lectures and guest speakers and podcasts and videos, but we also have to think about action-oriented things, such as how to write an advocacy brief. So many of you, when I'm reading cases, I see so many names of people, of psychologists who I look up to in our field who have contributed or have been cited in advocacy briefs. And it would be great for those of you that know how to do that to share that with trainees. Look at what great example the University of New Mexico is doing with these. I mean, we can share those kind of experiences in a greater context, especially through Zoom. How to write a letter to an editor about an important issue. How to model that. That can be a project that one does for an important issue that can either be something that they practice or something that you help them do in a real world situation for a real in a newspaper or in another forum. And to remember publications in interdisciplinary journals. Some of you know that I was, my background is in law, and I was an attorney first before becoming a psychologist. And I was having an important conversation with Natalie Anumba and Gina Vincent, and they were saying how oftentimes law review articles get the social science wrong. And we were talking about, I think collectively, I want to give them credit for having the idea of perhaps reaching out to some law journals and having some of us or having our students serve as social science editors on law reviews so that we can help other disciplines really understand what we can contribute and what we can help. Regular case presentations. So Riggs, Romaine, and Kavanaugh in 2019 talked about how our evaluees race or ethnicity in written forensic mental health reports have both risks and benefits, yet few resources provide guidance on when and how to include this information. And I don't want this to just be an article that we've read and thought about and then placed aside. I think that what it asks us to do is to practice, right? So regularly doing case presentations where we discuss ways to integrate identity variables in forensic evaluations, asking when should we do this? Where should we put this data? How should we include it? Why or why not? And gather around with other folks about how they've done it in their own evaluations and how they engaged in the thinking processes around why, when, where, how, why not. And again, not as experts, because there isn't going to be a one size fits all for these types of evaluations, because our evaluees are going to have different life experiences that may be salient to them, that may be salient and relevant to the questions posed by the courts, or may not be. For example, we may not want to out someone's sexual orientation if it's not relevant. However, we can see other situations in which it might be relevant. So I think, it's sort of like unlearning the way that we've done things. So I'll self-disclose and say that I didn't take typing class in high school very seriously, and now I'm not a very good typer. I don't type very fast. I have to look at the keys, and I'm very embarrassed by that. And I can take typing classes now to get that sort of muscle memory. And I think but it's hard to unlearn how we already have done things. And so I encourage these regular case presentations in which we can start to learn how to think about these things in new ways, but in a safe space, because we're all trying to learn how to do this together. We also want to talk about transparency around our limitations, like how often we have to use interpreters and the limitations therein. I can't tell you how many reports I've read where people don't even recognize that the use of interpreters in their evaluations may have caused some significant limitations. And I want to, I'm not sure if they're in the audience, but I want to recognize that the Cook County Juvenile Court Clinic, Chrissy Fernandez Smith, and Phil O'Donnell out there have done some great work and have written up a great way of writing about those limitations in report writing. And then dialoguing around these issues. I'll put a plug for the APLS Practice and Bridge Committees for putting out the Let's Talk series, which I think is informative, invites and helps us to exercise our critical thinking skills, but also models how we can have these difficult conversations in our own classes and training programs. And I also want to give a shout out to Division 45 programming when they do, which in their programming, they invite dialogue in and of itself as a submission format for their conferences, recognizing the need and the importance of dialogue. And community outreach programs. So I've listed some of these here, some of which you are familiar with, some of which our audience members are doing on a regular basis, and just being able to share this with our trainees, whether we're doing research, whether we create projects where we can engage in community outreach. I'll just share one example. As someone who started out in a community psychology program and worked closely with Julian Rappaport and Mark Aber, who are community psychologists, they had me facilitating dialogue between a predominantly white police force and communities of color. This was over 15 years ago in Champaign-Urbana, where the University of Illinois is located. And it probably gets one bullet point maybe on my CV, maybe even less than a bullet point. Sometimes I don't even include it, but it has been some of the most important work that I've engaged in, because I was able to use the skills I have as a psychologist to make real changes in the community. For example, some other work that we can be doing, and some of us already regularly do this, and that is doing workshops for attorneys and judges around issues of race and other identity variables. I can say that at every corner, there's an opportunity to do such community projects. In my work here at UMass, they have an asylum clinic that they just opened up. I want to say it's maybe a year or two old. I realized that a lot of the medical personnel had no real training in working with culturally diverse populations or working with interpreters or other things. And a Black medical student reached out to me and said, after I had done a talk about some of these issues, and said that she really wanted to work on creating tools. And so we've decided to do an asylum toolkit that we'll be offering to UMass, the asylum clinic, so that people that are engaging in this type of work can see some of the literature and things that they can build on to do their work moving forward. And I will also just touch briefly on policy reform within our institutions. And so, as I had mentioned, it's more than just curriculum. It's more than just adding things. It's more of seeing things through a different lens, and being open and having honest dialogue. And I hope that you'll find some practical tips and projects in my reference list as well. But some of the policy that we should be looking at is also developing important institutional policies. So, for example, I recently was called out by a trainee for not paying attention to and having a policy developed for how to address microaggressions. I don't know what that policy would look like, but I think it's important to have such a policy and to do the work around that and to not place that burden on the trainee to develop such a policy unless they want to do something like that. It's the work of advisors and mentors to be thinking proactively about these issues and how we would address them. Also, to highlight diversity grants. I know that in getting board certified in forensic psychology, they offer a diversity grant for board certification. So there's money left aside for that. And again, I want to highlight that we should be providing, or we should be asking speakers to come in and talk, and that these speakers we should consider them to be experts, not just in the research and in their practice, but in their lived experience, and that we should value that labor by having money set aside to be able to pay them for their experience and their talks to us. This slide is probably more important than any of the other slides that I have. I want to especially thank Jeffrey Burrell, who has offered me an opportunity to help with some of the diversity curricula development here at our UMass internship program. Ira Packer, who has always been a great mentor to me since my time here at UMass. Antoinette Kavanaugh, who many of you know as being a wonderful, wonderful mentor. Felissa Kortner, who's on this list, is someone who has reached out and has shared so many of her resources out at her internship program. Nori Lim, who does the internship program at Emory, and whose background in research and training is in this particular area, has also shared resources. The APLS Practice Committee, several names of whom I have listed individually here. Some of the people that I work with here at UMass, like Natalie Anumba, and some of my mentors and colleagues out from community psychology from back when I was at University of Illinois, E.J. David, Jacob Hess, Mark Aber, and some of the my own accountability group for calling me out when I need to be called out. And also I serve on the APA Continuing Education Committee, and they have a diversity subcommittee that's talking about these issues. And I want to thank them. And I especially want to thank the students, interns, and postdocs who have been courageous enough to call me out on some of the things that I need to do better at, and for helping me to grow in ways that I hope will make me a better supervisor, mentor, and educator moving forward. And then finally, I want to just I've told everybody that I'm willing to share my slides please, 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 if you're interested in this kind of work, if you want to talk more about this, I'm really looking for a community. I don't know if we can engage in a listserv of some kind or some sort of community where we can share resources. I can share some of the resources that I've collected and that others collected. So this is my personal email address to reach out to me in order to build that community. And then of course my references. So thank you for sticking with me through this presentation. And I am looking forward to any questions that you might have. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
All right. We had somebody who actually commented that they'd like to invite those who are interested to Psychology Anti-Racism Reading Group on Goodreads. I guess they host regular meetings to read an anti-racist book of choice. This individual posted their email address and a link in the Q&A. So hopefully you all can go in and find that if you're interested.
Oh, I just want to say thank you, Yara Cataluni. I'm totally butchering your name, but for inviting all of us to this group, and I am going to save this link right now before it disappears after this.
I'll leave it there. I won't touch it.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Let's see. Do you have any thoughts about the views of individuals who would like to maintain the traditional source, host, and cultural models in America today? Because under the preface that way people will be able to work, play, and communicate and get along better through the assimilation process.
I am not sure if I understand all aspects of that question. Was that in reference to supervision, did they say, or?
I believe it's not in reference to supervision, no.
Just a model of?
Just in general, yeah. It's okay if you don't have an answer
yes.
to it.
So, I mean, I think if I understand correctly, I think that there are some people that have the view and that have the perspective that, you know, engaging in certain ways helps others to kind of assimilate to the way that things are done and sort of socializes people into the way that psychologists think and so on and so forth. But I would say that there's also benefit to expanding our views to incorporate who they are and how they interact.
For those of you that couldn't find the link or the email address about the reading group, I posted it in the chat. I'm just realizing I only sent it to panelists. Hold on. Let me fix that. Okay. So it should be in the chat. That's where you can find it. Anybody else have questions?
If you don't have questions for me, that's okay, because again, I didn't hold myself out to be an expert, but you all have my email address, and I'm hoping that you'll reach out if you want to talk more or share resources around teaching and mentoring and supervision. I know a lot of you in the audience probably have a lot more experience than I do in those areas. So I'm very open to hearing about those. And I also just want to highlight in my reference list that you should all be receiving, I have links to a lot of the trainings that I participated in, like decolonizing supervision, decolonizing mentorship, that I've learned so much about, and again, Academics for Black Lives, and the Psychology of Radical Healing syllabus, which goes into specific activities that can be added to curriculum.
So we do have an individual here that would like you to speak more about the concept of calling out. And they're asking if this calling out or the calling out people, isn't this sort of the antithesis to the principles of kind guidance that should be prevalent in supervision?
So when I use the words calling out, I was talking about not necessarily, well, it can happen in supervision, it can happen in mentorship, it can happen in a class where a student or a trainee that feels that they were wronged or microaggressed against or something was misstated, quote unquote, calls you out, on what they felt was misstated or how they felt in reaction to your comment or how they experienced what you said as a microaggression. And so in that respect, like, I do think that there are so many different models of supervision. And I think that most models, there is this sort of foundation of kindness and being respectful. But I think there's a way of hearing. I think when I say calling out, I mean like the students calling you out, being open to that. And while we naturally may be defensive at first, maybe sitting with it and seeing why it was important for them to say those things. And I would say that sometimes we may have to call out others if we see those things happening. And we can do that in a kind way, sort of in an informative way. This is what, hey, I heard this being said, and I'm wondering what you meant by that. That type of thing.
Can you also talk a little bit about microaggressions and ways to recognize and cope with them in the classroom?
Like microaggressions are their own little thing. I mean, they can be anything from reacting to a student of color by saying that they're aggressive when they do call someone out. It can be a microaggression can be something like neglecting to acknowledge someone's identity, silencing certain voices, asking students of color to speak for other students of color, things like that. Saying things like, "Oh, your English is really good," or so, when someone looks ethnically different. And there's lots of trainings on microaggressions. Ways of dealing with that in the classroom. That's something that I think that we're still sort of working out policies for, but we're thinking about ways of like having, like, for example, in an internship program or in a postdoc program, maybe having someone that has a position in which the trainee can report the microaggression to, and then that person can act as a liaison between, maybe the supervisor that they experienced it with, or maybe the training director, or some other person that they've been working with in the hospital, for example. If it's in a classroom, maybe having someone have a discussion after class. And also, I think another way of dealing with it is bringing more information about microaggressions, because I think so few people understand what those are and don't even know that they're doing them.
To the individual that posted about the Goodreads group, somebody said that it's secret and they'd like to know what email they need to send to get, or where to send an email to get into the group. The next question is, can you share more information about limitations to using an interpreter? And do you potentially have any citations that you could send out if they emailed you?
Oh, yes. If that person can email me directly, I will send you the write-up that I do. I don't have it in front of me right now. But of course, There's lots of issues with using an interpreter, such as, not being able, like making sure that you meet with the interpreter beforehand, going over ground rules, making sure there's no conflict between the interpreter and the person that they're interpreting for, and making, so, and there are some limitations to that. The best practice is always to do the evaluation in the language, in the language of the native language of the evaluee. But we recognize as a profession that there's just a mismatch of psychologists who actually speak all of the languages of the people that we serve. So please email me directly and I'll send you the write-up that I do in my reports.
What are the ways that we can participate in creating these anti-racist policies? What are good ways to get started if we don't have additional training in policy writing or policy making?
I think that's a great question. So I think that there are a lot of cultural consultants out there who would be willing to help us develop such policies. I've reached out to some of these cultural consultants myself, and there are pretty high fees that are associated. And I know that for these consultative services, as there should be, because this is important work, but I know that we're limited by our funds in our respective institutions and our places of employment. So I think that those of us that want to take that a step further, let's reach out, let's connect with each other, and maybe we can hire someone and kind of defray the cost a little bit, and they can help walk us through some of the ways to do that, and to do it in a way that's still legally and ethically sound within our institutions.
This next individual sees a lot of people complain about tone policing in conversations, but then also people talk about calling people out in sort of a kind and hopefully an effective manner. So how do you recommend striking a balance between the two?
Tone policing and calling out people. That's tough. That's really tough. I don't think I have all the answers here. I know that striking that balance, I think it depends on the specific situation, how many other people are in the room, how comfortable people are within the space. I think a proactive way before we even get to that stage is making sure that in our syllabi and in sort of our supervisory contracts and things like that, we have sort of these policies in place in order to create safe spaces, so that people are aware that maybe some of this tone policing and things is what might occur in the space.
Do you think it would be possible to share either share your slide with your email address on it or type it for people in the chat? I have a few people asking for your email address.
Oh, yes. Now, please, definitely you'll get a copy of my slides, but I think wait, I think I sent that as a direct message. Did I send that to everybody? No.
Let me see. You sent it to me directly. I'll forward it to everyone. Don't worry about it.
Okay, great. Yes, please reach out to me. Because you are all asking some really tough questions, some questions that I have been asking myself. And I think the more of us that can talk about these issues, we can kind of think of ways to do this work better. So I'm sorry that some of my answers may not be as well thought out. I'm hoping that we can come up with some of these answers together.
This next individual says there have been a few articles written about fear that supervisors in various settings like medical schools or psychology, these supervisors are noting that they're afraid of enforcing or giving feedback on issues like timeliness or civility, because these are supposed to be Eurocentric values. What are your thoughts on these concerns? Is giving feedback on professionalism, timeliness, and civility oppressive at all? Or colonialist?
Yes, I have actually heard this and I have mixed feelings about it, to be honest. I have heard that, especially in this past year, this has become an issue with a lot of the race-based violence being more visible and the hate rhetoric and the pandemic. There's been a pushback by students and trainees of that you should not be enforcing like timeliness on certain things, that people should deserve more time because they're dealing with so much trauma, and they feel like it's oppressive to have to turn things in a timely way without having it recognized that they're going through some other issues. I have mixed thoughts about that. I think in some contexts that may work, but in other contexts, the reality is that, those of us that do court reports, there's a due date. Those of us that have to submit something for a publication, there's a due date. We're hurting clients if we don't have a report to the court if we're doing therapy with them. So, and by teaching that there is always that we can always accommodate for things like giving you more time or whatnot, maybe sending the message that those grace periods are going to be recognized in the systems that we work, and they often will not be. That's not to say, though, that we shouldn't have policies of maybe increased personal days and things like that during times in which there is more significant trauma affecting our trainees.
Thank you. Just to let you all know, it is past the hour. So for those of you that need to jump off, you're welcome to. We do have a couple more questions, if that's okay.
Okay.
Great. This next individual is asking, what can we do as evaluators, supervisors, and advocates to make conversations surrounding cultural and social identities safer for all students, to reduce negative evaluations about us for introducing these conversations?
First, I think there needs to be ground rules, and I think we need to make sure that our conversations and our activities are thoughtful. So for example, some of you may have used the privilege walk, where you stand in a line and you say if you've ever experienced such and such thing, step forward or step back. And there's lots of pushback about that in articles written now about how that's been negatively received by people of color, because it's essentially using them as an example using their sometimes traumatic experiences as examples for white students to learn about their own privilege. So to be thoughtful about that, to have ground rules that I think that everybody works together to create. And I think that it's important to work with administration too, or bosses or higher ups in the places that we work in, to describe that this is what we're going to be doing, so they have the heads up. Like I said, I'm not sure if I cited it in the reference list, but there is research that shows that those of us that are engaging in this type of work tend to get more negative evaluations and more complaints to administration because people feel uncomfortable talking about these issues. So I think that if we work with our administrations to just kind of explain what we're doing and why there might be this feedback, would help, as well as having sound ground rules and making sure that we have exercises and activities that are thoughtfully chosen and implemented.
Okay, one last question. This individual says in the forensic areas that they work, which are like corrections or sex offender evaluations, there's a startling lack of diversity. Do you have any thoughts about this?
I have a lot of thoughts about this. Yeah. I think it says something about our profession and about certain areas where we think, what is it about us that makes us feel unwelcome or uninviting? Why aren't some people choosing our profession? Why don't people want to, people of color or of minoritized groups want to be forensic psychologists? Have we given them space? Have we given them voice? Have we amplified their voices? I've had thoughts about reaching out to perhaps undergraduate students and maybe I've had predominantly Black colleges. I've had colleagues that have reached out and done presentations there where where you can talk about your work and talk about what you're doing, because they may not be exposed to it, and just having speakers go out and sort of doing this type of recruitment would at least validate that they would be welcome in the field, and that we have a place for them, that we want them there, that we care about recruiting and diversity, and that they have a space at the table. So that's one of the things that I would recommend. But I think there's just, as a whole, our profession needs to be thinking about why it is that so few people of color and other marginalized groups are becoming forensic psychologists.
Thank you so much for your time today. This was fantastic and really, really important topic. So we're grateful to have you.
Thank you so much for having me here and giving me this space. And I hope that I get to link up with a lot of the folks that joined today.
Definitely. Have a nice day. Everyone else, we're going to stay on for just a couple minutes more. Make sure you grab your CE link and we will see you all next week.